This is really a book review. A very good book came out. Golly, maybe I have the date here. 1985. The title of the book is Why the Jews? The two authors, one is Dennis Prager, and the other, I don't remember his first name. His name is Telushkin. I don't agree with either of them all the time. So the fact that I'm presenting the work they did in this book should not be taken as an endorsement of them as authorities. But I think this book, they did a very good job, a very interesting job, because in searching for reason for anti-Semitism, they did a very broad historical survey of where and when anti-Semitism has existed and under what conditions, looking for a common thread. Now, I call this the reason for potential anti-Semitism because there's a difference between Jew hatred, which is what they're talking about, what I want to share with you, on the one hand, and actual physical persecution of Jews, which might be held back for reasons that the government sees as important, but would have nothing to do with the hatred of Jews in that society. So what we're looking for is a reason to explain why Jews are hated, where and when they are hated. Now, the first thing we need to do is to look at the historical survey, and after we have the historical survey in front of us, those are the facts that need to be explained, then we can look at the various proposed explanations and see if they fit the facts. And they organize their survey this way. You want to know, where have Jews been hated? What were the local conditions going on in those places where and when the Jews were hated? And the relative strength of the hatred. How much hatred was there? To what extent did it eat up the population? If you find systematic differences in the strength of the hatred, that has to be explained also. Whatever hypothesis that you put forward to explain why Jews are hated should, if possible, explain also the strength of the hatred. So let's start with the historical survey. Even on the surface, this is the most widespread, most consistent single human hatred in all of human history. That one group should be hated by so many different people in so many different times over a long stretch of human history is unique in its extent, the Jewish people. Now, it's interesting that you can trace the origins of Jew hatred to the ancient world before Christianity. If someone thinks that Christianity invented anti-Semitism because of their myth that we killed their God, that's simply not true. The Greeks had it, the Egyptians had it, and the Romans had it. So, for example, it's very interesting that in the 3rd century BCE, 250 years before the Common Era, 300 years before the beginning of Christianity, we have a quote from an Egyptian priest named Manetho, where he says that Jews were slaves in Egypt. And there was a big exodus. Only he says the exodus took place because the Jews were lepers and they were infecting the Egyptians. So the Egyptians chased them out to save themselves from the diseased Jews. When I first read that, I thought, okay, here's an Egyptian priest 1,000 years after the Exodus, who knows about it. So he put a spin on it, a pro-Egyptian spin on it. And I thought, wait a second. It's not even much of a spin. What does the Torah tell us? The Torah tells us we were there. The last plague was the death of the firstborn. And it says the Egyptians came and forced the Jews out, saying, we're all going to die. Kulana Mesid. All Manetho did was put a name on it. He called it leprosy, when in fact it was a plague from God. And here you have this attitude of justifying hatred of Jews, traced back to a historical event 1,000 years before, with the spin of its being leprosy, and that's found in Egypt 250 years before the Common Era. Also, the critique is expressed that the Jews believed in an invisible God. Now you have to understand, in the ancient world, Maimonides documents this in his world 1,000 years ago. You're talking about something invisible, that's talking about nonsense. No things are invisible. Everything is physical. Everything is physical. You say it's not physical, you might just as well say it doesn't exist. So Jews say, we believe in a God, but he's invisible. That was a joke. In the ancient world, that was a joke. Which means that they treated us as atheists, and that was a matter of contempt, intellectual contempt, social contempt, political contempt, not to recognize the forces around you, and that they're under the control of powers and so forth and so on. So here you have in ancient Egypt, 250 years before the Common Era, the War of Hanukkah, which was approximately 167 BCE. That's the 2nd century BCE. One historian documents that there was no religious persecution or war in the ancient world. He says this is the first religious war for 1,000 years. Why? Because there was nothing to fight about. Because if you believed in one religion and your next door neighboring nation believed in a different religion, you recognize that his religion is valid, and he recognizes your religion is valid. You're serving your local gods. He's serving his local gods. If he comes and visits your country, he will offer sacrifices to your gods because your gods are in charge of your country, and vice versa. There was nothing to fight about. The only group in the ancient world who said, we and only we have a true religion, our God is real, all the rest of the gods are non-existent, phony, was the Jewish people. So you have Greek persecution of Judaism. And from the same period of time, we have a Greek writer named Appian, who writes that Jews practiced ritual murder. It's a blood libel. The Christians didn't invent the blood libels, saying that we use Christian blood for matzahs. This goes back to Greece. The story was that before Pesach, the Jews would capture a Greek and fatten him up and slaughter him to use his blood for the Paschal celebration. So the idea of ritual murder goes back to the Greeks 200 years before Christianity. The Romans had an interesting history with us. The early Rome respected us. In fact, there was a conflict over who should be high priest, and one chased the other one out. The other one, he ran to Greece, and the Greeks received him with great respect. Went to Sparta, received with great respect. Rome had a policy in its empire that every country that it conquered could practice its natural religion, and every country should be respected. And they recognized that the Jews had a lot of wisdom, and they treated the Jews with respect. There's only one thing: the Jews didn't want to bow down to Jupiter, and they wouldn't allow putting a statue to Jupiter in the temple, and that stuck in the Romans' throats. They didn't like that, and there were 3 attempts that finally succeeded in destroying the Jewish army and destroying the temple and causing the exile. And they made laws against the practice of Judaism, which they didn't do for any other religion except Christianity, which they saw as an offshoot of Judaism. Wherever else they ruled, local religions were tolerated. All you had to do was add to your temple a statue of Jupiter, which local people thought was quite reasonable, because if the Romans are governing you, then their God must be very powerful. Indeed, at least right now, he must be more powerful than your gods. So add sacrifices to Jupiter just for your own good sense. At any rate, the hatred of Jews Goes back to before the Christian era. Okay. As a result of the Roman defeat in the 4th century, the whole Roman Empire became Christian. That's because you had different subgroups, different religions, different cults were competing with one another. It was hard to coordinate the empire. It was hard to get loyalty to the empire. So Constantine, the emperor, said, in order to unify the empire, I'm going to make it all Christian. Many historians say that he never became Christian. He remained a pagan to the end of his days. It was just a ploy to unify the empire. When he did that, Christianity became in charge of the whole of Europe and North Africa, even east of here to a certain extent. So they had enormous, enormous power. And of course, there was enormous hatred of Jews. And that goes back to their earliest sources. In the book of Matthew, we are identified as the killers of the Messiah. In the book of John, we're called devils. An early Christian saint, St. John Chrysostom, said that a synagogue is a brothel, place for prostitutes, drunkenness, and murder. That's how the synagogue was described in early Christian sources. The libel of ritual murder for matzah and poisoning the Christian population became very popular. Luther, who led the Reformation against Rome and started Protestant Christianity, had the same hatred of Jews. The Nazi phrase that was used over and over again, Unglück, the Jews are our misfortune, is a quote from Luther. And as everyone knows, the murder and persecution and ultimately the Holocaust. Now, if you come to the history of Europe in the last 400 years, the beginning of the Enlightenment, so they document the leaders of the Enlightenment and their attitude towards Jews. Voltaire, who wrote the Philosophical Dictionary, which was really just a diatribe against religion, most of it, and it has an enormous proportion of entries against Judaism. At the time, Jews were a very minor section of Europe, and his focus was against Christianity, but he had a lot of entries against Jews. And he accused Jews of human sacrifice. Understand, this man is supposed to be super educated, super cultured, super sophisticated, super objective, looking only for the truth. Okay, Jews practice human sacrifice, and they're guilty of revolting superstition, and they're abominable. That's the attitude of Voltaire. Mirabeau, another Frenchman, he offered the following piece of logic. Anti-Semitism is very widespread, isn't it? Well then, if so many people hate Jews, there must be a good reason for it. Must be a good reason for it, and they must deserve to be hated. How could so many people be wrong? That doesn't even deserve to be called naive. Fichte, in Germany at that time, said, if you give Jews civil rights, the Jews will trample on the rest of the population. Now at that time, Jews were 1% of the population of Germany. Imagine that state of mind. You're worried that 1% will dominate the 99%. That's astonishing. Do you really think you're so inferior? Do you think the gods have supernatural power on their side? No, this is an Enlightenment figure. What are you afraid of? Nothing but anti-Semitism. To create a false sphere to make people be hated. Then you have the left. Marx's anti-Semitism is well known. Marx wrote that the Jewish God is money, and that they are filthy, and that they're lepers. Fourier in France, Jews are parasites. Emancipation, that means equal rights for Jews. is a vice of society. It's a vice, it's an evil. To give equal rights to Jews is an evil. This is the left, which supposedly prides itself in being super intellectual and super moral and so forth and so on, doesn't protect them to this day from anti-Semitism. Proudhon in France, Jews are poison, they're an enemy. Listen to this. Either send them to Asia, back to where they came, or exterminate them. That's France, the beginning of the Enlightenment. Already the idea of exterminating the Jews, born in France. So this is a hatred that's been going on for more than 2,000 years. It goes back to ancient Egypt, to ancient Greece, to ancient Rome. Then it's been inherited by Christianity and Islam. And it's consistent, as I don't have to tell you, up until the present day. That's the extent. Now they continue the historical analysis by pointing out the details of the record in terms of the extent and also the relative strength. There's no, when they wrote this in 1985, there's no documented anti-Semitism in the Far East. Not in China, not in India, not in Japan, until the internet became popular, and then some people in Japan were affected by literature from elsewhere, but it wasn't homegrown. So there were Jewish communities, and yet somehow the idea of hating them because they're Jews, or persecuting them because they're Jews, didn't arise in India, didn't arise in Japan, it didn't arise in China. So that has to be explained. Why are the Western experiences different? A second detail of the record, in all cases but one, a Jew could escape the anti-Semitism by converting. If it was Christian anti-Semitism, he could become a Christian. If it was Muslim anti-Semitism, he could become a Muslim. If it was far-left anti-Semitism, he could become a member of the far left. He could renounce his own religion. Marx, after all, was Jewish. Right? He didn't suffer anti-Semitism because he became a self-hating Jew and he joined the club of anti-Semites, and then he was accepted. The communists, if you were a Jew and you were playing their game, you could be accepted. The only exception to that, of course, is Germany, the Nazis. Right? The Nazis would kill you if one of your 4 grandparents was Jewish. They couldn't care less what you believe in, what your values are, what you identify with. But in all other cases, conversion was possible. So this has to be explained. Someone who wants to explain anti-Semitism has to explain the extent of it, where it is and where it isn't, has to explain why conversion was almost always a way out. And then the relative strength. Now, how can I judge the relative strength of Jew hatred? Here we have to rely on the actions that people take. As I told you before, that's an imperfect gauge because people may hate Jews but don't take action against them because the government wants to protect. The Polish government at a certain time realized that the Jews were bringing civilization and an economy. You know, the Jews introduced money into Poland. Before the Jews came in, they were in a barter economy, just trading stuff. So at a certain point, the Polish kings realized having the Jews around is good for the development of the country. Then the anti-Semites had to go undercover because the king wouldn't allow it. The hatred was there. And what we're trying to explain is the hatred. And of course, we have to use the sporadic outbreaks as a measure of the ferocity of the hatred. We can't do any better than that. We can't read into people's hearts. But the relative strength of the hatred, they say, is this. From least to most, you have the Enlightenment world, Voltaire and his company, who definitely preached anti-Semitic ideas, but did very little in the way of actually persecuting Jews, which is an indication that although they were anti-Semitic, it wasn't a priority, and it wasn't something that drove them to irrational, violent expression. After that came the ancient world. He showed the ancient world had anti-Semitic overtones, but very little was done about it. The Greeks had their idea that we practiced ritual murder and so on and so on, but obviously didn't happen often, and it wasn't thousands of Greeks every year, and so on and so on. So they believed it, but they didn't do much about it. By the way, one of the things that in the ancient world, the Greeks and the Romans said about the Jews, that they're the laziest people on earth. Can you imagine a holiday every week? Nothing like that existed in the world. You work, that's all. There was one time when the Roman calendar consisted of 12 months of 30 days. You'll tell me 12 months of 30 days is only 360 days. The year's got to be 365 days. That's right. 5 days were off the calendar. They had no dates. Anything and everything could happen in those 5 days. Because they weren't really dates. They're just, 5 times 24 hours. Then you go back to the dates. Work. This is the kind of attitude that people had. Invisible God means you're an atheist, you don't have a God. But very little was done about it in the ancient world. After that, you have Islam. Islam took measures against Jews. We were second-class citizens. We had to pay special taxes, sometimes special garments, sometimes special segregation, and sometimes, rarely, active persecution. After that, you have the left. The left was bitterly anti-religious across the board, but specifically in their war against religion, the war against Judaism was very focused, to the extent that yeshiva bachrim from yeshivas like Volozhin went over to the communist side, were used as informants to tell the government how to crush Judaism. And they used to give advice, like, in the springtime, make sure there are no private bakeries, or you should bake anything because there shouldn't be matzah, and no private pools to be used as mikvos. They infiltrated yeshivas, pretending to be frum, pretending to come to study Torah. They distributed Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, and they actively recruited boys to leave the yeshiva. This was an active, direct attempt to wipe Judaism out. That you didn't have under Islam. You didn't have under Islam. By the way, you may have heard of debates. In the Muslim world, there were often debates, open debates between someone representing Greek philosophy, someone representing Christianity, somebody representing Islam, and a rabbi representing Judaism. They were open, free debates, and there were no penalties. If you lost, there was no penalty. Just people came, and they listened, and they argued, and it was an open, free debate. That's Islam. The left took active steps against Judaism, Christianity, I don't have to tell you. Persecutions, the Crusades, the Chamoneki pogroms, where hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed in short periods of time, martyred in short periods of time. And there were plans. Christianity, some forms of Christianity have it that the end will come only when the last Jews convert to Christianity. So one plan was, kill all the Jews in Europe, and leave over 400, and put them on an island, and work on them until they convert. And when they convert, then the Messiah will come, and then that'll be the end of history. These were the ideas that you had in Christian circles. And then, even more intense than that, of course, were the Nazis, whose goal was simply to kill every man, woman, and child on the face of the earth. They don't take into account Purim. They don't go back that far in history to the Persians. So that story, I'm going to follow them and leaving that out. I'm not sure how to deal with that. I'm just mentioning it, but I'm leaving it out. Now the question is how to explain the extent, the relative strength of the hatreds. Here are explanations that have been used in the literature, and they go through them one by one, and they compare the explanations with the evidence, which I should just tell you, depressingly, is almost never done in history. It's almost never done. You make a list of all the evidence, you take a hypothesis and measure it against the evidence. What anybody would do in chemistry, somehow in history, it's not done that way. But I like it. I think that's the right way to do it. What about a scapegoat? Some people tell you the reason Jews are hated because they are scapegoats for the failures of the society. You could always blame whatever goes wrong on the Jews. And that way you have an excuse for your own failures. So they point out that why should every society over 2,000 years in the whole of the West used the same scapegoat. You want a local population, a victim population, a population that you can take advantage of. Would it by chance be that in every case it's always the Jews, whether they're 10% of the population or 1% of the population, whether they're prominent or they aren't prominent? Not adequate to say, because the conditions aren't always going to hold. Furthermore, Jews were hated in good times, when there was nothing to need a scapegoat for, because the country was successful, and they were hated in any case. And number three, if you're using the Jews as a scapegoat, that's very convenient. You don't want to eliminate them. Why would you want to eliminate every man, woman, and child who's Jewish? You lose your scapegoat. Any intelligent political planner is going to say, we need scapegoats. The Jews are convenient scapegoats. Let's keep them around, so we can blame them when something goes wrong. To have a policy of eliminating all of them is not consistent with treating them as scapegoats. And also, the extent of Nazi Jew hatred was so monumentally irrational, self-defeating for themselves, that it goes beyond what you could expect the idea of a scapegoat to justify. If you're going to read a book about the Holocaust, one extremely good book is The War Against the Jews by Lucy Davidovitz, who was a historian of the Holocaust. And she documents the extent to which the Second World War, from the point of view of the Germans, was a war against the Jews. Yes, they conquered Europe, and yes, they were trying to conquer England, and they were looking together with the Japanese and the Italians to foster control of the world as a whole. Yes, they were doing all of that. But the focus was really on Jews, to the extent that in 1944, when the Allies had opened up a front against Germany, and the war was in question, when there was competition between the SS and the army for trains, the SS got the trains, and the army did not. That means they were more interested in killing Jews than they were in winning the war. That's not consistent with being a scapegoat. This goes far, far beyond treating the Jews as a scapegoat. So that theory just doesn't wash. It doesn't fit the historical facts. How about economics? One thought is a contributory thought, that in the Middle Ages, Jews lent money at interest to Christians, because Christians took the biblical prohibition against taking interest on loans directly. They said it's wrong to do that, you can't do that, and therefore they couldn't borrow money at interest for themselves, and therefore Christians who needed money for investment or to save themselves against some problem, the only people they could borrow money from was Jews. Christians wouldn't lend money with no interest, so if they're prohibited from taking interest, they didn't lend money. Jews lent money at interest because we know the prohibition in the Torah is only that Jews shouldn't take interest from Jews, but Jews could take interest from non-Jews. Well, this theory says, so you see how vicious the Jews are. You see how vicious the Jews are. This vicious policy of taking interest on loans, Jews only practiced it to non-Jews, and not to Jews. That's why Jews were hated. Well, listen, boys and girls, this is totally upside down. First of all, one of the reasons that Jews lent money at interest is because they were prohibited from operating in other professions. They weren't allowed in some places to own land. They weren't allowed to practice agriculture. Some places they weren't allowed to be in industry. So you say, you can't do all these things. This is left to you, and if you do this, you're evil. That means the Jew taking interest on a loan is a result of the hatred, not the cause of the hatred. But more than that, there's no logic in this at all. Is there anything vicious about lending out my money and charging interest? Let me ask you a question. If you want to rent my home, going away for the summer and rent my home, can I charge you for using my home? Sure. Everybody does that. Avis Rent-A-Car. They own a fleet of cars. You want to drive their car, you pay them rent for using their car. Anything wrong with that? Anything vicious about that? Surely not. Well, when you use my home, you could pay me rent. And if you use my car, you could pay me rent. Why not if you use my money? You could pay me rent for using my money. What's wrong with that? Is every bank viciously evil because they lend money at interest? Surely not. So you'll ask, why then do Jews not take interest from other Jews? Let me ask you a question. There's nothing vicious about taking money on a loan, taking interest on a loan. If your brother asked you for a loan, would you take interest?
No.
No. The Jewish people is a family. We have a responsibility to treat each other as members of a family. Non-Jews have to be treated justly. Family members have to go beyond that. They don't treat family members the way they treat strangers. So the idea that usury, that taking interest on loans, is a cause of Jewish hatred is just nuts. How about rich? Because we were rich, we excited other people's envy. That's why there's Jewish hatred. But there were times when Jews were desperately poor. In Russia, there were some rich Jews, there were some rich non-Jews also. But there were masses and masses of desperately poor Jews. And if you're talking about being rich, generating anti-Semitism, where ought to be the heart of anti-Semitism in the world today? The US of A. Jews are phenomenally wealthy in the United States. Phenomenally wealthy. By the way, who invented Facebook? A Jew, right? Who invented Google? A Jew. Those guys are rich. It's hard to find people who are richer than they. The Jews are phenomenally wealthy. If it's wealth, then contemporary America ought to be a hotbed of anti-Semitism, and it isn't. So the idea of being rich, that being rich is what stimulates the anti-Semitism, is simply not correct. Some want to say that it's a disease. Anti-Semitism is just a disease. Well,
they don't have a choice.
Okay, that's an interesting question. Number one, that's an interesting question. If you call it a disease, it sounds like there's nothing you can do about it. And certainly, that's not true. Education helps, experience helps. But more than that, to say that from ancient Egypt and ancient Greece and ancient Rome and all of the Europe going on for thousands of years, that there's this disease that's being transmitted, some kind of transmission from person to person, it's just wild. There's no such thing, no plausible disease that fits that bill. That being the case, all of the common explanations, say Prager and Talishkin, don't fit the evidence. Now they offer their explanation. And this is really unique, I think. The correct explanation is hatred of a competing ideology. A group hates Jews to the extent that Jewish ideology threatens them. What Jews believe and their existence undermines their claim to their truth, their claim to their status, their claim to their value. The more it undermines, the more they hate. It's hatred of a competing ideology. Let's go through the facts and see if this explanation fits the facts. India, with hundreds of millions of people, and a few pockets of Jews here and there, that's competition? They're trivial. They're trivial. Whatever they stand for, what they believe in, the fact that they exist, no competition to hundreds of millions of Hindus, no competition to hundreds of millions of Muslims that exist there, and have existed there through history. China is the same thing. There's no competition. Local Japan is the same thing. Too small and too insignificant to pose any competition, and therefore there was never any pressure.
You mentioned the place that the Jews were 1%. So how come over there they hated them?
You'll see, because there's only 1% in that country. If it's a hatred that embraces a whole continent, you may have it locally, but your next door neighbor has them, right? And they're a common enemy. Here, talking about the whole of China, the whole of India. It's not as if 200 miles away there are a billion Jews, right? They're nowhere in the whole continent. Now let's talk about the relative strength. Enlightenment, which has the least hatred. The attitude of the Enlightenment is religion is dead. It's dead. We're going to work for education, universal education, and we're going to stress science, and religion will just fade away. Why get upset about it when it's going to fade away? Like a generation, 2 generations, 3 generations, and it's over. It's done. No point in beating a drum over something that's naturally going to fade away anyway. That's why, although they were anti-Semitic, there was no strong hatred. It's a lost cause anyhow, so why bother pursuing them? The ancient world? Well, the ancient world was based on religious tolerance. Every religion recognized the appropriateness of every other religion. That was the whole framework of the ancient world. Now here you have this religion, which is a pain in the neck. They have an invisible God, and they think that they're right and everybody else is wrong. But still, it's a framework of mutual respect that governs the overall attitudes. So this is irritating. But it's not any more than that. And of course, we were a tiny group, and the ideas that we believed in were so crazy from the point of view of the ancient world. No competition there, just weirdos, that's all. Islam, there's a much more serious competition. Because Islam claims that they are the inheritors of the Jewish Bible. Remember, they say that Muhammad was in the Jewish Bible and we took him out. If we hadn't done that vicious thing, then it would be obvious that they're a continuation of Moses, continuation of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So we, by having our Bible and believing in it and dedicating our lives to it, are saying to them, you've made up a myth. Your whole history is based on a myth. That's serious competition. And that being the case, they took measures against us. The left was against all religion, and the left believed in violent political campaigns, and Jewish ideology contradicts the left on all points. The left are atheists, and we believe in a creator. The left believes that all people are equal, and we say all people are not equal. The left believes that everything is determined by economics, and we say that the human culture is varied and has many roots, and certainly is not all dependent upon economics. Point by point, Jewish ideology contradicts them, and we refuse to disappear. As the left conquers more territory and more people, and so we just refuse to disappear. As long as there are Jews alive and Jews operating, functioning according to their ideology, the left has obvious counterexamples staring it in the face. By the way, when Marx wrote about economic determinism, that economics determines the whole of culture, the existence of the Jewish people is a gigantic counterexample. Because we lived under every culture, every economic system, and we're all the same. So it couldn't be that economics determined our culture, and if it didn't determine our culture, who says it determines other cultures as well? So therefore, the left had a stronger and more violent campaign against Judaism. Christianity, the Jewish people and the Jewish ideology says you have no God. If you believe in a Trinity, that's not God. That's polytheism. That's idol worship. Until the Protestant Reformation in the 15th century, the Trinity was everything. Only that now you have strains of Protestant Christianity which gave up the Trinity. But before that, everybody had a Trinity. So there, the difference is crucial. It goes to the heart of the religion, it goes to the heart of the idea of God. And therefore it called forth a very strong, violent opposition. And the Nazis, in a sense, even more so. Because, as Hitler, Yamach Shemo, wrote, the Jews cursed the world by introducing the conscience. The conscience has moral restraint, moral requirements, moral obligations. He was against Christianity, but he located the source of Christianity in Judaism. And as long as Jews existed, it was, as he put it, there can't be two chosen people. Two chosen peoples, only one. We, the Aryans, are the chosen people, and that means the Jews have to disappear. Because if they don't, there'll be two claiming that they're chosen. That can't be tolerated. So it was an obliteration of the foundation of their entire ideology, and that's why they responded to the Jewish people with unrestricted violence, violence of absolute annihilation. Now, if that's the explanation, what's the diagnosis and what's the solution? So they said, well, if that's the explanation, as long as other peoples live according to an ideology that Judaism contradicts, there's going to be anti-Semitism. There's going to be anti-Semitism. It's not going to go away by political programs and, social programs and all the rest. Now, what kind of solutions can we hope for? So here you have people who say, and this has been practiced, assimilate. Give up your own Jewish identity. If there's nobody to hate, then there'll be nobody to hate. Against this, they argue, number one, it's not fair. The Jews are the victims. Why are you asking the victims to give up their identity so as to deprive the criminals of their target? And number two, it's not going to happen. If anything is constant in history, it's 3,000 years of Jewish identity not disappearing. So if you're looking for a solution to anti-Semitism, that's not where it's going to come from. There are always going to be identified Jews, and they're always going to be practicing Jewish values and believing in Jewish ideology, and that being the case, total assimilation is not going to happen. Social action can help when the surrounding society is sympathetic. In other words, you have a society within which there are anti-Semites, there are anti-Semitic elements, but the general society is sympathetic. There are Nazis in the United States. There are openly anti-Semitic groups in the United States. Free speech allows people to hate whomever they want to hate, and even to write about their ideology. As long as they don't preach violent action, they can write about and criticize other groups, rightly or wrongly. Free speech protects that. But it's, at the very least, it's not done. Open anti-Semitism isn't done. And in many cases, I believe, Americans really are not anti-Semitic. They really do care about Jews. They really care about Israel. America has been online in helping Israel since 1948, consistently. People write about the ups and downs. This president, that president. The support is there, and the people have a great deal of support. But that's where you can do social action. Try social action against anti-Semitism in various places in Europe. It's very dangerous. It's very dangerous because there are large Muslim populations, and they are preaching anti-Semitism, and it becomes very difficult. So the idea of social action could have a limited effect, but it can't solve the problem. They offer, as the only practical solution, try to make the world more Jewish. Try to make the world more Jewish. Preach the ideas of our values. Preach the principles of our ideology. Argue for them. Try to convince the world that they ought to evolve more in our direction. After all, historically, if you go back 3,000 years, the world is enormously more Jewish today than it was 3,000 years ago. The world has bought various fundamental Jewish ideas. A great deal of the world is not polytheistic, doesn't worship idols anymore. They understand and practice, they believe in human brotherhood, the idea of justice. There are some things that they've taken from Judaism. Work for more growth of the world in a Jewish direction, then there'll be less conflict. There'll be less conflict between what they believe and what we believe. There'll be less hatred, less anti-Semitism. Now, in this, and we're talking now not about conversion. We're not talking about preaching conversion. We're preaching that the world as a whole should adopt more Jewish picture of how the world should develop. And this can be fought on many levels. For example, the horrific liberalization of the family that's been going on in the West and even to a great extent in the United States. We have to stand against that because that creates a false picture of who parents are, who children are, what male and female are, to stand up for our picture of how the world should work. And if we make progress in that, we will reduce the conflict, which is the source of anti-Semitism. Now, one more remark. They make a very, I think, important observation here. Sometimes we work together with other people who have different point of view from us, different values, because we have common cause in certain issues, like the rainbow family approach in America, which means just like there are many hues in the rainbow, so there are many different kinds of families. 2 men as parents, 2 women as parents, 1 woman as parent, 1 man as parent. They're less sympathetic of because they don't like men. Commune, places where the parents aren't identified. Let variety be your guide. Catholics are against that also. And we work together, hand in hand, with Catholics and other religious groups with whom we disagree on this common issue where we do agree. When this is done, this has to be done with great care to stake out our own unique identity, not to have any blurring of the differences between the groups when they happen to agree on a particular policy. By the way, the model here is American democracy. How does American democracy work? How is it that there are 2 big parties? In Italy, there are a dozen parties. Here, there are a dozen parties. Greece, there are a dozen parties. How is it that in America, there are 2 big parties? Because the 2 big parties are made out of different interest groups. Southern Democrats don't have all that, have a lot not in common with Democrats from New England, but they log roll. It's called log rolling. You vote for my measure, and I'll vote for your measure. No Democrat in Tennessee identifies deeply with a Democrat from Connecticut, but they know if they work together under one common umbrella, they're more likely to get position of power, and they're likely to have their individual interests forward. That's what we have to do when we work with other people to make sure that our identity is not blurred. Because in the end of the day, what we want is to make the world more Jewish. And that would include affecting other religions as well. That, they say, is the only hope for real progress against anti-Semitism. Now, I'm not a historian, and I'm not a sociologist, but as a logician, this is the kind of analysis that I can respect. They did a survey of the evidence. They did they assessed the other explanations that are given, and they showed that they're not consistent with the evidence. They offered theirs. They showed that it's consistent with the evidence. I think it's a very, very interesting and important study. Now, one thing you could do, of course, is look it up on Amazon. Look up the book on Amazon and see what the reviews say. Sometimes reviews on Amazon are quite intelligent. It does happen. That's what I wanted to tell you about. You have questions or comments that's on your mind?
I have a question about sort of that last statement you made, and how is it that we can go about preserving the family unit? How is it that we can go about that without perhaps fostering frustration with Jews from, we might win friends on one side but make enemies on the other. We might make friends with Catholics, but then the LGBT community will take it as a sort of, as a direct offense.
Yes, well, here we're talking about making the world more Jewish in ideology. There may be Jews who will find that a threat. Jews will find it a threat that the world should become more Jewish in ideology. Then those are the people whom we have to address and convert also. Right? We shouldn't give up our principles on the grounds that'll make some people unhappy. On the contrary, that's a reason to argue for our principles, to explain our principles, to try to make people understand that they're making a mistake. It's not a question of winning a popularity contest. It's a question of changing people's values, changing people's principles.
But isn't there still the concern of, so by making the world more Jewish will lower anti-Semitic mentality, or I guess that's my concern, is that it feels like we might, like I said, might win friends on one side, but then make new enemies on the other, and that seems counterproductive.
Again, imagine that we succeed in making the world more Jewish. That means we reduce the LGBT community. We reduce them. There are less of them. Right? Some will remain, but there'll be less of them because they'll take on our picture of marriage. So then we will have made more friends than we will have made enemies. Right? That is to make the world more Jewish, so that the conflict of Judaism and the world is less. That's the goal. And if some of the people we create conflict with is other Jews, that's as old as Jewish history. We've been facing that as long as Jewish history exists.
So, I know that I think the Chabad, the Rabbi was very big with promoting the Noahide laws. To spread out the Noahide laws and make the world more Jewish. Do you think that would be a good place to start?
I'm glad you mentioned that. I think that's right because
I remember last time I was here, I got a little card that said like the seven ways to world peace, and it was the Noahide laws, but it was kind of guised in a very like not so
open.
Yeah, it was more like yeah.
Okay, I think that's right. Anybody who's going to pledge allegiance to the Noahide laws is going to do so because he shares our vision of where the world came from.
7 steps to world peace: belief in God, do not worship idols, respect God and praise Him, do not blaspheme His name, respect human life, do not murder, respect the family, do not commit immoral sexual acts, respect for others, rights and property, do not steal, creation of a judicial system, pursue justice, respect all creatures, and do not eat the flesh of an animal that is still alive. And it's noahide.org.
That's very interesting. It's an interesting idea. At any rate, I think you're right. I think that, and there are institutions that work doing it. There are websites, there are groups that promote the Noahide laws, and I think that's right.